Farm Basics is brought to you by the Liberty Link trait and Liberty herbicide from Bayer. The most reliable weed management solution, Liberty Link and Liberty herbicide are the link to efficient row crop production and sustainable weed management.
During our Farm Basics time today, we're going to talk a little about noxious weeds. If you're a non-farmer, you might be wondering, well, what's a noxious weed? That's why we wanted to get into it.
Well, okay, noxious is a pretty tough term, and you may think, wow, that must mean poisonous weeds or weeds that are super dangerous for me. Well, it's not necessarily dangerous for you. When we think about noxious weeds, we're looking at weeds that can seriously hurt the land, for example, like leafy spurge. When it chokes out all the other vegetation out there, and leafy spurge is not something that our cattle really want to eat, all of a sudden our pasture ground is just worthless. That could be one way. It could be a weed that could hurt animals or could hurt wildlife in the area, but more commonly we're looking at really difficult to control perennial weeds that can just take over the vegetation in a certain area.
So I think about Canada thistle, even on our own farm. Years ago, before we had really good herbicides to stop Canada thistle, I didn't even know what to do because tillage didn't destroy this plant. It was, and still is, obviously, a perennial plant. It's got these rhizomes running below ground. So even if you kill the plant that you see right here today, because of those rhizomes running far out from the main plant, quite often you'll find little shoots sticking up maybe 5, 10, 20 feet away. They're all tied to that one plant. Well, when you go in and do some tillage and you cut those roots up a little bit, now you've got a whole bunch of separate plants, and unfortunately it seems like they have a way of surviving. So until we got good herbicides, it was really difficult to stop this particular weed, and that's the reason why it was a noxious weed. Fortunately, now today we have some good products in pastures. A guy can go out with Milestone or even Tordon, and in crop ground, thanks to Roundup Crops, we've got Roundup, which can kill perennial weeds like Canada thistle.
And Stinger has always been a good one too for Canada thistle if we're in a crop like small grains or corn, something like that. There are lots of choices out there now, and here's one of the things that I was thinking about too, Brian, is just how do we control noxious weeds? You know, a lot of people will say, well, why don't we get some bugs that will feed on them and get them under control? And it takes time to do that, and it takes a lot of bugs to do that. With herbicides, we can actually get down into that root system, kill that weed once and for all. I think herbicides have been very good for controlling noxious weeds. Like for example, on our great-grandpa's farm, I remember when we were kids and we were out walking soybeans, well, we'd pull all the annual weeds, but the thistles, it's like, wow, it's not going to do us any good. We could cut it off at the ground and it'll just grow back again. I remember our great uncle say, all right, boys, I've fought this Canada thistle for 40 years. Now it's your turn. And a few years later, we had Roundup Ready crops and we completely wiped it out. And we had Stinger that we were using in our corn and we just about completely wiped it out.
Okay, when you come back to using bugs to control weeds, what I get concerned about, I've done a lot of entomology work in my lifetime, and I had this great entomologist who was a kind of a mentor to me, and he just said, anytime you're going to bring in something else, like a bug, to control either another bug or a weed, what harm is that bug going to do for you long term? Well, in a lot of cases, we don't know for sure. When you go use a herbicide, all that herbicide is 100% gone in a year or two, maybe it's 2 or 3 years, but with that bug, it might be around for not just one lifetime, but it might be around for 100 years, and it might do a whole bunch of harm to the next crop that we decide we're going to raise in this particular area. It's a lot more dangerous to do that. That's why people get really concerned about using bugs as opposed to herbicides.
Well, when we have noxious weeds, it is very important that you get them under control, and in many cases you are required by law, whether it's the county that's going to be watching you or federal agencies that are going to be watching
or
you,
the state,
to control those weeds so they don't spread from your farm or from your field or from your roadside. So you'll see a lot of farmers out throughout the entire season. If those weeds are up, they're going to have to either mow them down or spray them or do something to get them under control.
And if they don't, the county or the state or even the federal government can go in on their land. They have permission to do this in the United States, and go in on their land and control that weed and charge the farmer for it and fine the farmer because he didn't control that noxious weed. This is a serious deal. These are the most invasive, most destroying, economically damaging weeds that we have in the country. They're called noxious weeds. There are different weeds that are noxious by state level as opposed to the federal level. There are some weeds that are noxious weed across the entire United States, others that are just by state, and just in a particular state it's a big problem. But the point is, anytime you have a noxious weed as a farmer or a non-farmer, you've got to get that thing under control.
Well, fortunately for us, our weed of the week is not a noxious weed. Can you identify this week's weed?